The day my father-in-law called me trash, I was 15 minutes from wiring $18 million to rescue his dying company. My name is Miles Carter. I'm 38, and I make a living moving money through corridors most people don't know exist. Anonymous partnerships, discretionary trusts, layered holding companies with names that sound like lakes and trees and bland law firms. I design capital the way an engineer designs an airplane wing, quietly, precisely, with no room for showmanship and a violent allergy to loose screws. But it's hard to feel precise when a man in a monogrammed bathrobe is waving a coffee mug in your face in his sunlit kitchen and calling you worthless. You know what I told Ariel when she brought you around? Asked Graham Ellison, founder and unchallenged autocrat of Helixvale Therapeutics. He paced the length of his kitchen like a drill sergeant who'd lost his way in a home goods catalog, all marble counters and hanging copper pans, and a ridiculous espresso machine polished to mirror shine. I said, if you must marry a man in finance, at least marry one I've heard of. Across from him, my wife stirred cold eggs with the kind of attention usually reserved for bomb defusal. Ariel's hair was pulled into a tight knot that exposed the freckle on her left temple. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at her father. She stared at the plate as if the right pattern of circles would end the scene. Miles works in private investments, Dad. She said finally, small voice, eyes down. Private investments, Graham sneered, as if the phrase tasted sour. Translation, nothing real. He doesn't build anything. He doesn't sell anything. He moves numbers. That's not a trade. It's a trick. Sir, I said, because I was raised by a teacher in a one-bathroom house and civility sticks to you like old varnish. You've made your opinion very clear. He jabbed the air with his mug. You don't defend yourself because you can't. Men with real careers can summarize them in a sentence. I design bridges. I perform surgery. I run a research lab. What would you say at a dinner party? I can't talk about what I do. How convenient. Dad. Ariel's fork clinked against porcelain. Her voice had the careful rhythm of an apology she'd practiced too often. Please. He didn't hear her. He never did when his mouth was moving. You know who asked after you last week? Peter Nguyen, cardiac at Hennepin General. He asked if you'd finally gotten a real job. I told him we're still waiting. Ariel raised her eyes just enough to measure the angle of my shoulders. She needed me to do what I'd done 100 times. Let it pass. Make a joke. Absorb the hit. We'd go home, she'd say. He's older, he's set in his ways. And I would squeeze her hand and tell her it was fine. But something felt different that morning. Maybe it was the quiet humiliation of watching a man with a legacy payroll tax problem call me a parasite while his company bled out on a conference table. Maybe it was the fact that my last round of due diligence had confirmed what my instincts were already screaming. That Helixvale had been surviving for 2 years on branding and bravado. Maybe it was Ariel's eyes, brown and clever and tired, trained not on me, but on the eggs. Graham, I said, standing. You're right. He blinked, composure jostled. What? You're right that Ariel deserves better. His laugh came too fast, a bark that expected its echo. Finally, he says something true. Enjoy your coffee, I said, and set my napkin beside the plate. To my wife, I said, I'll be at the office, and then I walked out past the framed magazine covers celebrating Graham's visionary leadership, past the gallery of smiling photographs. Ariel on a ski slope with her father's arm like a trophy around her waist, Graham shaking hands with a senator whose name always seemed to precede the words ethics inquiry. In the driveway, the cold bit through my sleeves. Minneapolis autumn, the honest kind. It chewed your knuckles and reminded you the world didn't revolve around anyone's kitchen. I put both palms on the roof of my car and stood there until my breath didn't taste like anger. 15 minutes later, I sat in the quiet of my office, staring at a draft term sheet for an investment I no longer plan to make. The world thinks private equity is a smoke-filled room full of men with loosened ties agreeing to get a company over stake. That's television's fault. My world is quieter. Numbers, yes, but numbers with bones. You can feel a company's skeleton if you read long enough, where the joints grind, where the marrow thins. Helixvale's skeleton had been screaming for months. Declining reimbursement rates, a trial that should never have started, a lab chief who had resigned with a letter that sounded like a prayer. And under all that, The arrogance of a founder who thought FDA guidance was a suggestion for less intelligent men. I hadn't intended to rescue them. Anonymous capital isn't charity. It's the art of paying for risk you understand at a discount. But a few months back, when I was undecided, I'd sat with a pot of coffee and a stack of Helix Veil's clinical data until 3 in the morning. Buried in the noise, there was a compound with promise. If they pivoted, if they got out of their own way, they could be profitable in 18 to 24 months. The plan needed discipline. It needed people who knew when to say no. It did not need the kind of man who used his daughter's birthday dinners to measure his own manhood. I'd created the vehicle, a Bland Delaware LLC with a name that sounded like a hiking trail, Moraine Ridge Holdings. Moraine Ridge was owned by a trust in Nevada, which was owned by a trust in the Cook Islands, which was managed by a foundation whose board had 3 members I could count on to keep their mouths shut until the grave. By noon that day, everything would have been ready for the wire. Instead, I called my attorney. Kendra, I said, when she picked up on the second ring. I want a withdrawal notice drafted and ready to deliver at 10 tomorrow morning. Kendra Lowe had represented me for 8 years. She didn't ask why. Investment entity? Moraine Ridge. Add a voluntary waiver to non-disclosure with respect to my identity. You want to be the one who tells them. I want to be able to. Kendra hummed, which meant she was building the chessboard in her head, names and pieces and places I'd never see. Done. I'll courier the documents myself. And Kendra. I rubbed my thumb across a gouge in my desk. I remembered putting it there with a stapler the day after I bought the building and deciding not to fix it. Make the language plain. No threats, no theatrics. Just optically surgical. You're in that mood, she said, and the corner of my mouth lifted. I'll send you drafts in an hour. I set the phone down and turned to the wall of glass that looked over the river. The Mississippi was a vein of slate, slow and inevitable. Barges shouldered north. Runners breathed steam. The city kept doing what cities do, and somewhere across town a man I could cripple with a single sentence stood in a robe and congratulated himself on his masculinity. I had met Ariel 5 years earlier at a conference in St. Paul whose theme, translating bench science into bedside solutions, only a grant writer could love. She was on a panel about gene therapies, speaking without slides, no safety net. A scientist who could explain metabolic pathways in a way that made donors lean forward. Her laugh was unafraid. She wasn't beautiful in the manicured way her mother preferred. She was beautiful like a problem you wanted to keep solving because it rewarded you as you worked. We were married in a park without a permit and with sandwiches made by my cousin. Graham didn't come. He sent a gift, an espresso machine like the one in his kitchen, and a card that said, "Try not to waste my daughter's potential." When Ariel cried on the porch steps that night, head on my shoulder, I told her it didn't matter. We'd build a life that didn't require his approval. For 3 years, our life was ordinary and therefore good. We rented a cheap apartment that smelled like other people's cooking and bought a cheap house with a yard full of dandelions. I did what I've always done, met with people in rooms where the windows didn't open, asked for datasets no one liked to share, said no 95% of the time, said yes 5% of the time, and then worked until the yes behaved. Ariel went to the lab each morning with a backpack and a ponytail and an optimism that survived on too much coffee and the belief that work mattered more than credit. The first crack was a small thing, like the pop from a joint you didn't know could hurt. We were at a dinner at Graham's house, and his brother-in-law asked me what I did. I gave him the same 5 words I gave everyone by design. I structure private investment vehicles. Graham emptied his wine glass with a flourish and said, "For whom?" And when I said, "For clients," he leaned back and smiled at the table like a man who had proven gravity. The room laughed in a way that wasn't funny. After that, it was little bloodlettings. "You work with spreadsheets, right?" He'd ask when he wanted to box me. "Numbers on screens?" "You must know something about earnings," he'd tell a cousin at Easter. "Even if you've never earned a day's sweat." Ariel would squeeze my leg under the table so hard I'd feel fingerprints for an hour. "He doesn't mean it," she'd say in the car. "He's jealous of anyone who isn't him." But she never told him to stop. It was as if she'd been built without the peace that allowed you to look at the person who raised you and say, "Enough." 3 months before the kitchen scene, I learned something I couldn't unknow. Helix Veil had pushed a molecule called HX217 to clinical trials against the advice of its research lead. The compound degraded at body temperature faster than their early models predicted. The safety profile was muddy at best. Fillers couldn't stabilize it. Ariel had written a 20-something page memo that she thought could save the company. Graham called her risk-averse, a scientist's worst insult from a businessman who couldn't read a chromatogram. HX 217 died a public death when the FDA bounced their application in language so stern even the board blushed. Graham spun it as pivoting to a new horizon, then fired the research lead and 3 senior scientists, including the woman who mentored Ariel when she first came to Helixvale. After that, Ariel left and took a job at a smaller institute where the principal investigator actually listened. I learned all of this not from my wife, who told me only that it wasn't a good fit, but from a former Helixvale chemist named Rosa Vargas who spoke in measured sentences over tea one afternoon. He thinks science is a vending machine, Rosa said. He puts money in and wants a product to drop. When nothing drops, he kicks the machine. It took discipline not to sign the term sheet anyway. The numbers made sense if you believed you could move Graham out of his own way. But I know my own weakness. I like fixing things. I like turning machines that clank into machines that hum. It's how men who look calm end up married to women who stir eggs at their father's house instead of throwing the fork down. I watched Kendra's drafts populate in my inbox. The withdrawal letter, a termination of the non-binding LOI, a non-disclosure waiver. I read them twice. They were exactly what I had asked for, clean like scalpel work. I signed, and Kendra said, 10 a.m. tomorrow. He'll have them by 10:03. I spent that evening in my den with a legal pad mapping angles the way a winter driver maps ice. I wrote 3 names at the top: Graham, the board chair, the senior lender. I wrote a 4th name, Ariel, and underlined it. I drafted 2 text messages. One said, "We should have had this conversation 3 years ago," and one said, "I'm the anonymous investor your father has been courting." I scheduled them and turned my phone off. At 9:45 the next morning, I called my wife. "Miles," she said, "my name a question. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I said. "I want you to sit down." "I am," she lied. I could hear her moving, the rustle of a coat she'd just pulled on, the whisper of a car door. "I invested in Helixvale through an entity called Moraine Ridge Holdings," I said. "We were prepared to wire $18 million. I withdrew the offer yesterday." Kendra delivered the notice at 10. Silence is a complicated sound. This one had shame in it and a thin wire of hope. "That's not possible," she said at last. "You don't." She stopped herself before she could say, "You don't have that kind of money." Because if our marriage left her with anything, it left her with a residual respect for the parts of me she did not understand. "Why?" she said instead. "You know why?" I said. "You've known since your birthday dinner." "That was," she faltered. "He doesn't mean it the way it sounds. He never means anything the way it sounds. That's the trick of men like your father. They build little escape hatches into the walls of their sentences." "Miles, please." I could hear breath catching against a low sob. "Don't do this to him. Not like this. People work there. Our friends. Helixvale can find another investor," I said. "One who enjoys being insulted over roast beef. You're punishing him because he hurt your pride." "No," I said. "I'm leaving him to his math because he hurt yours." Her breath went ragged. "What does that mean?" "You're the bravest scientist I know," I said. "You wrote memo after memo saying HX 217 wasn't ready. He called you small and then made your life small. And you let him. And you let him talk about me like a man who couldn't hold a wrench." "I didn't know what to say," she whispered. "He's my father." "I know," I said, and meant it. "And that's why I'm not telling the paper what he did to your research team. I'm telling him I won't be his unseen god." At 10, the scheduled texts flew. I watched the read receipts appear next to Ariel's name, then next to Graham's. I watched the break happen in a silence you could slice. He called 5 minutes later. "You sanctimonious bastard," he said by way of hello. "Who do you think you are?" "I think I'm a man who considered a business decision and made one." "This is about my daughter," he said hotly. "You're punishing me because she loves me. If she had any sense, she'd leave you. Maybe this will teach her." "I don't need a class from you," I said. "We didn't have a contract. We had a letter with verbs like intend and anticipate." I changed my mind. "Then change it back," he said, and the please sounded like it had been dragged through glass. "Name your price." "I don't have a price for you, Graham." He breathed hard into the phone. I'll apologize, he said like a man throwing coins in a well. I'll do it in front of your wife. I'll do it at the club. You don't have a club anymore, I said, and he made a noise. How dare you, he said. Do you know what it takes to run a company? Yes, I said. I know better than you do. I hung up. My thumb shook once after I set the phone down. Then I unlocked the bottom drawer of my desk, pulled out a folder with Helix Vale's vendor list, and began crossing out vendors I knew Moraine Ridge could not rescue even if it wanted to. My hands were steady by the third stroke. That afternoon, Ariel came home. She stood in the doorway in a coat she found on sale and said, I told him to stop. I told him to stop 2 years ago. Her chin trembled. He laughed. I know, I said. She rubbed her hands together to warm them and to keep them from breaking. If you love me, she said, you won't ruin him. If you loved me, I said, you would have told him to shut up while I was still sitting at the table. I slept in the guest room that night. In the morning, she packed a duffel bag and took half her shoes. She left a note that said, I need time. I folded the note in half and slid it into a book of poems I never read. News travels a particular way in a town like ours. Investors don't call reporters, reporters call investors. The local business journal ran a piece the following week. Helix Vale Therapeutics loses major backer. Layoffs possible. The piece quoted no one with a name, which meant the quotes were good. The paper printed the number 18 million as if it had been leaked by someone who wanted to be precise and measured. The board chair was unavailable for comment. A former lab tech said, we saw this coming. Graham said nothing. 2 days after the story, a second fund withdrew a tentative offer for $6 million in convertible notes. They had never liked Graham's insistence on vision over plan, and no one likes to be the last sucker to the table. Helix Vale slowed payables to a crawl. They cut the coffee service, then consolidated 2 floors into one, then furloughed the entire vivarium staff on a Friday, which is the day you pick if you want to force a ruin through a weekend. Ariel filed for divorce 3 days after the furloughs. She did it cleanly, through a lawyer who sent a professional email asking for a meeting about consensual dissolution. The request came with a proposal that split our assets down to the percentage point. I read it twice, then called Kendra. Give her anything she wants that won't cripple me, I said. Miles, Kendra said carefully. This is generous to the point of foolishness. I married her, Kendra, I said. She may not have defended me, but she didn't defraud me. Write the papers. I knew about the second part, the part no one saw, because Rosa texted me from a new number. She told him. The message read. All of it. About what he did to her work. About how he treats people. It was not quiet. Was it useless? I wrote back. For him, she replied. Maybe. For her? No. People think schadenfreude is glee. It's not. It's a kind of quiet relief at not being alone in the equation anymore. I did not rejoice when I drove past Graham's house 2 months later and saw the for sale sign at an angle, dirty from rain. The yard had dandelions that would have made him call a contractor in the past. He was on his knees, tugging weeds with a rage that looked a lot like prayer. By then, Helix Vale had closed the Discovery West site and transferred select assets to a competitor who wanted the patents, not the people. I'd heard through a contact that Graham had tried to piece together a last-minute rescue from friends at his club, only to discover that friends at clubs are interested right up until you ask them for something measurable. The day the company posted its bankruptcy filing, the Business Journal ran a photograph of the Helix Vale sign being unbolted from the building. It looked a little like a tooth coming out. I took a walk by the river that night, an old habit. Minneapolis is best at night in October. Black water, real stars, air that forgives. I thought of the first day I'd met Ariel and how her hands had moved when she explained to Jean's stubbornness. I thought of the kitchen and the eggs, and how there are 100 times in a marriage when you choose, and you don't know you chose until much later. I thought of the silence in a phone line when a man who has never had to ask for anything has to ask you for his life, and cannot find a price. A few weeks later, I flew to San Diego to visit a clinic my firm was underwriting. It was a small place with white walls and a staff that slouched like they had earned it. In a conference room the size of a closet, I shook hands with a researcher who had once worked under Ariel. She's at the Pacific Neuro Institute. The woman sat over sandwiches, running her own program, a grant with her name on it. She's different. In a good way. I went to see her give a talk. She used her father's company as a cautionary tale without saying the name. Her smile was soft. You did that in your way. She's doing it in hers. I didn't ask for Ariel's number. I didn't look up flights that night to California. I went back to my hotel, opened my laptop, and read through 3 proposals for a new fund I'd been sketching in the margins of my days. Operator-led carve-outs. The memo at the top read, "Find the builders who got trapped under talkers." There was an email from Rosa with a CV attached. The subject line said, "Helixvale Diaspora. Hire them." I typed a reply that said, "Interview Monday," and slept without dreaming. I moved to Asheville the following spring. People who haven't been there think of banjos and beer. There are those. There are also hills that fold like cloth, and mornings where the fog sits right on the road, a kind of hush you drive through. I bought a building that used to be a furniture warehouse and filled it with people who like spreadsheets and silence and know how to say no. I picked a new name for the new entity, Quarry Bend, and paid a local sign shop to make it look like we'd been there a generation. When anyone asked what we did, I said, "We buy good companies from bad owners and let the good ones run," which is the closest I've ever come to a one-sentence summary. Kendra came down for the opening and stood in the doorway to my office, hands on hips. "You look lighter," she said, which in Kendra's language is a compliment so lavish it almost counts as gossip. "I feel like someone took a piano off my chest and replaced it with a decent briefcase," I said. She laughed. "Poetry from the numbers man." "You did good work," I said. "Thank you." "It was surgical," she said with a small, satisfied smile. "Just the way you asked." We hired 4 people that month who used to sit at Helixvale benches running experiments Graham never read. They built us a diligence process for early-stage medical tooling acquisitions that felt like the lab notes they missed. Columns neat, protocols precise, conclusions cautious. I sat with them the first Friday and asked about their worst days. People who have had to pull pipettes in rooms where the lighting is wrong can smell a liar. They could tell I wanted to hire not just their brains, but their bruises. They came to work early on Monday and stayed late because the work fed the part of them that had starved. On a Saturday in June, my phone buzzed with a number I did not know. The voice on the other end said, "Mr. Carter? This is Weston Long. I'm reaching out on behalf of Mr. Ellison. Is this an okay time?" It always amazed me. Men who throw plates hire people who ask for okay times. "Yes," I said, and sat on the step in front of my building, scuffed from moving boxes. "Mr. Ellison wanted me to tell you he's accepted a consulting position with Cathax Bio. He wanted to make sure you heard it from him and not from the paper." "I appreciate it," I said. "He also asked me to ask if there is any possibility of revisiting the conversation about Helixvale assets. There's been some motion." I watched a pair of college kids cross the street with iced coffees, Sunny and 20 and Invincible. "I'm not interested in revisiting anything," I said. "But I hope he makes peace with his daughter." There was a pause. "About that," Weston said carefully, "I believe they are not speaking. Maybe they will someday," I said. 2 months later, on my way back from a site visit in Knoxville, I stopped at a farmer's market, because peaches make a liar out of your calendar. I was paying for a pint when I saw him. Graham stood at a table of tomatoes, tentative and adrift in a place where no one knew his last name. He had the posture of a man who used to shout across rooms and now worries he is shouting in line at the bank. He picked up a tomato, put it down, picked up another, and, after too long, handed a crumpled 20 to a woman who smiled at him without knowing she was rescuing a man from humiliation. I left without saying anything. Revenge that requires an audience is really a plea for a witness. What I wanted was the quiet relief of not needing one. Ariel never called. I didn't expect her to. Through a friend I didn't share with anyone else, I learned that she married a surgeon 2 years later in a garden in La Jolla. The photographs looked kind, which is a rare and valuable quality in a face. I hoped she had found someone who made her laugh like she did when she explained cellular transport. I hoped he did not need her to choose. One evening, a full year after The Kitchen and the Eggs, I walked past a television in a bar and saw the cheering. Helixvale founder advises on industry ethics. I laughed, small and not bitter, because the world is always going to find a way to recommend foxes as consultants on henhouse design. I did not change the channel. I paid for my drink, left cash for the bartender who was studying for an EMT exam on his breaks, and stepped out into a night that smelled like rain and heat. When people ask me now whether I believe in revenge, I tell them I believe in gravity. You can pretend it isn't there. You can build cathedrals and companies and myths. But the ground has its say eventually. My part is math and patience, and sometimes a signature withheld. Graham taught me one useful thing. Nothing exposes a man's character like telling him no. He had run a life where yes came easy and loud. The first clean no landed like a mirror. He did not like what he saw. In the end, I did not ruin him. He just finally met himself without applause. Sometimes the most brutal kind of justice requires no headline, no shout, no slam of a gavel. Only the decision not to save a man from his own momentum. And sometimes the person dismissed as worthless turns out to be the only one who understood where the floor was.